Great. Well, thank you, Theo, for organising this, and thank everybody for joining. I apologise for the state of my parliamentary curtains. At least you know that they're not wasting taxpayers' money on very expensive curtains. But we're not here to talk about curtains. We're here to talk about energy and COVID-19 and the challenges of climate change and what all that means. And we've got three fantastic guests who know a lot about this and are more than just knowing a lot about it. They are critical players in this space. We've got Sam Hollister from EnergyUK, Guy Newey from the Energy Systems Catapult, and Isabella O'Dowd, who's a climate change specialist at the World Wildlife Foundation. So we will come to them in a sec. And before I come to them, what I just wanted to really explain at a high level here is that the fundamental question is, what challenges has the energy sector faced in relation to COVID-19 so far? What has COVID-19 done to change the game in the respect of renewable energy and climate change and the sector, and how that has affected things? And how central does net zero remain as the energy sector's plan for recovery? Because there is a suspicion, I don't share it actually, but there's a suspicion amongst some that because of the economic difficulties and various other problems that COVID-19 has caused, that net zero will take a backseat. So it'd be interesting to hear about that as well from our speakers, and indeed from people asking questions. What I want to start by doing is really introducing Sam Hollister, who's Director of Economics and Corporate Services at EnergyUK. And if Sam would just say a few words in 5 minutes or so about his thoughts on these areas. Sam, over to you.
Thank you very much, Bim, and thank you, Theo, for organising and for people participating. I really just want to touch on kind of some of the things that Bim just picked up there around kind of the opportunities going forward. But let's just first reflect on what's happened. One of the things to come out of the terrible pandemic is just how the energy sector kind of rallied to support its customers and ensure that lights stayed on. Very quickly, energy suppliers committed to supporting their customers who were impacted through COVID, whether that be by extending credit or actually posting prepayment meter top-up cards through the post for those who were shielding. And the power sector, very used to scenario planning and the strong focus on health and safety, was able to ensure the plans were in place to continue to operate as critical national infrastructure. And we've worked really closely as EnergyUK with government over the last 4 months to make sure that customers who were impacted and remained kind of safe and well served, and the industry kind of continued to power the nation. Whereas now we kind of need to look forwards and work with government over the next few months around how we actually repower the economic recovery and the role that energy can play in that, and very much supportive of what Bim was just alluding to there, the role that net zero can take in that. What we already know is that government spent billions through the pandemic. So any recovery is going to need to leverage private finance and kind of build on kind of the corporate mechanisms that we have in place. And actually, the energy sector is well placed to do that already. We invest around £13 billion per annum currently, and we are prepared to kind of step up and do more for that to deliver net zero and to reboost the economy with the kind of right partnerships and relationships with government. We have a report coming out on Monday where we identify 5 priority areas where we can provide the stimulus for jobs, for investment, for growth, with the energy sector helping to deliver the widespread economic recovery and reform, and the societal benefits that we probably learned from over the last few months of how we kind of have reacted, and some of the things that we've kind of learned as a result. So we're recommending to launch a national housing infrastructure upgrade programme to further accelerate the transition to low carbon transport, to unlock further private investment in digital, flexible and affordable low carbon energy system, and to accelerate the development of regional industrial clusters and local supply chains to support people, businesses and local communities to recover from the crisis. Now, done the right way, the economic recovery can support our transition to a low carbon society, creating a stronger, more resilient economy. And if we just reflect on what we need to do, hasn't actually changed from where we were a few months ago. If, as many expect, many people are now going to work from home more often as a result of the practices that we put in place over the last 3 months, it's actually pushed further the urgent need to improve our building stock even harder, as we're going to spend more time there. We knew, for instance, that to reach net zero, we needed to improve energy efficiency. To reduce people's bills, we needed to improve energy efficiency. To transition to low carbon heat, we needed to improve energy efficiency. Well, now even more, we need to kind of step up that program and improve the energy performance of our buildings as homes become our offices, and how we're going to spend more time there, but also how the impact of the pandemic is going to influence people's bills as the recession bites, and anything that we can do to alleviate that pressure. Now, the government's already committed over £6 billion towards retrofitting buildings. So what we need is actually a plan to kind of stimulate that money coming forward. And we're backing a national, we're calling for a government-backed national infrastructure programme, because that's the best way that we can do something at scale quickly and fairly, and that means jobs. We also look at low carbon heating systems, and we're looking to develop a sector deal where actually we can work with government to create jobs, to create a partnership, to create innovation and create exports. And we're joining the call for an ambitious target, for instance, to install 1 million low carbon heating systems by 2025 in order to stimulate that market response. With the move to EVs upon us, let's make sure that any financial package to all the automotive sector is actually kind of encouraging the switch to electric vehicles. We have a very successful plug-in car grant scheme. Well, can we increase that in a time-limited amount for the next couple of years, where we can actually just stimulate that transition to EVs? And also, let's make good on some of the things that we know we're going to need around battery technology and automotive supply chains. There are also areas where the government and the UK can lead, and also areas where we need to not be left behind. We know that hydrogen is going to play some role in our future for 2050, where there are discussions ongoing around kind of exactly what role that is, or if you like, what colour the hydrogen is going to be. Well, let's put together a strategy for hydrogen. And also, let's hold Pathfinder auctions for hydrogen this year, where we can start to develop small-scale hydrogen Pathfinder projects and build that up year on year, so that we actually have an established hydrogen economy hydrogen industry by 2030. If we don't, we risk falling behind people like Germany, the Netherlands, and China, who are already investing heavily in this area. And one area where we could certainly position ourselves well, is if we move early, is in carbon capture, use and storage, which can support decarbonisation across industry at scale. So let's develop the forward-looking regulatory frameworks that can actually put that investment into place and develop R&D and promote UK innovation and export. And finally, net zero is going to mean greater electrification across all ranges of scenarios. So we need to invest in our existing generation capacity and look forward to new investment as well. Whether that means new nuclear, offshore, onshore wind, solar, tidal, the suite of technologies are all going to play a role. So let's make sure that each have a route to market. I think what we need to know is actually that there is a kind of a way forward, and it doesn't mean one or the other between net zero and decarbonising the economy and rebooting the economy. But actually there are opportunities to deliver skills, jobs, and economic growth across the regions as we make sure that we can do both. So yeah, I'll stop there, Bim, because I'm sure I probably went over my 5 minutes.
No, that's fine. Thank you very much, Sam. That's very helpful. I think it'll probably be easier if I ask questions at the end of once all three of you have made your statements. So, but lots to think about, and for just to summarize what I took away from that, I think the stuff you said about the housing infrastructure plan, developing regional industrial clusters, hydrogen, CCS, or CCUS, as you described it, more electrification, all those issues I'm sure are things that we'll get into later. Guy Newey from the Energy Systems Catapult.
Thanks, Bim. It's worth saying that even without COVID-19 and its obviously significant impacts on the economy, net zero was a huge challenge, a huge set of activity that needed to happen anyway. We just before lockdown started, we produced a set of scenarios out to 2050 as part of our Innovating to Net Zero report. And just to give you some of the kind of numbers you're talking about a doubling of power demand over the next 30 years. We need our power system to go completely clean, and then create another new power system to deliver the same thing. We need a potentially huge increase in district heating in areas where it's difficult to decarbonize. You could use up to kind of 300 terawatt hours of zero carbon hydrogen by 2050, and the quantity that we produce in a low carbon way in the UK is is extremely small, but if you're thinking about industrial decarbonisation and HGVs and issues, those are incredibly important. So the scale of the challenge was huge anyway, as Sam measured. But as you're thinking about how you come out of the recovery and the kind of changing nature of your economy and what boost you might give in that situation, the economics will be pointing to you to areas where you think you have the kind of least regret measures, where you think these transformations are going to have to happen anyway. You're just going to speed them up, and the green economy is the strongest candidate for that, because it is part of a long-term transformation that's going to happen anyway. So taking the opportunity to move forward, and that will be really important. And that means the numbers of the investment in offshore wind. You're looking at kind of 75 gigawatts plus by 2050 of that enormous investment program. CCUS, nuclear, got a new report on the potential for nuclear out today. Buildings, crucially, which is going to be such a challenge, and indeed can help drive some of the skills and jobs you need. So all of that is absolutely right. One point I think is really important. If I was in government and thinking about how you would do this, is that the next wave of action on climate change is going to require a lot more first of all, from people, from consumers, accepting different technologies. But crucially, it's going to be geographically specific, because you're into decarbonising heat and buildings and transport. And the requirements of Brighton on that journey are very different from the requirements of Kilmarnock or Harpenden, to pick three places at random. You need to understand the state of the local building stock. What's suitable for heat pumps, what's suitable for district heating, where is the fuel poverty that you can try and address. And you need a robust plan built in with local consensus, building on the political will that you're starting to see in these climate emergencies, that actually is a real plan, a credible plan that people can invest off. And we think that kind of the need for that local activity based around serious planning is really important. And we've been developing a kind of, could you have 3 or 4 or 5 places across the UK, which are kind of pathfinders, places where you're going hell for leather at net zero and learning and developing the skills in a particular area, thinking about the local supply chains, making it a kind of scale opportunity for innovators that we, the innovation agency, which is the Energy Systems Catapult, talk about the whole time. And we think those kind of, could be a potential galvanizing project, both for local areas, but also for the rest of the country, thinking about what might be the important point. The final point I'll make is about innovation generally. We've got lots of the technologies that are going to be that obviously going to be important for net zero, but lots of them have got to come down in cost. Lots of them have got to be deployed and integrated, and we have got a whole new energy system that we need to design. Key characteristics of that, which are going to be important over the coming years: how flexible is it? With that huge power demand and intermittent sources like offshore wind, thinking about how the demand side is going to be flexible towards that is going to be really important. That's often about getting markets right. It's a really kind of energy geeks like me get excited about it, but it's essential for us unlocking the potential and keeping the costs down as well. The final point as well, I'd say is digital technology as a hugely important enabler in this area. The energy sector is, if I'm charitable, at kind of foothills of exploiting the potential of digital technology, certainly compared to some other sectors where we spend a lot of money. There is huge excitement and potential around there. We just did a mapping exercise of all the kind of what could broadly be described as digital energy companies. Without even thinking about it, we got to 200 in the UK. It's a real area of strength, but they're going to need markets to go into, regulation to fit. We're going to have to think about new forms of consumer protection, but it's a really exciting opportunity, which is certainly exportable. So as I said at the start, there's a huge challenge. These are really difficult. Net zero is a total transformation of the economy, but it is a massive opportunity for the kind of companies that we want to see do well in the future world.
Great, thanks, Guy. I'm particularly interested in what you said about the regional or local, indeed, local impacts of that. That's something I hadn't thought about at all. And I think that quite often, and you'll know this from your experience at BEIS, quite often we think about energy. Energy is one of those policy areas which gets thought out in a highly macro level. You know, what's the UK going to do? What, you know, and that's fine, because obviously a huge part of it is that. But I don't think that we talk enough about those local and regional aspects. So I think that's something that's definitely worth going into. Isabella, last but by no means least.
Great, thank you, Bim. Yes, I'm Isabella O'Dowd, climate change specialist at WWF. And I think where I come from on this topic is sort of more on the kind of general climate change. So for the last 2 years, I've been working on our net zero policy. And before COVID-19 happened, I was working specifically on the investments needed to get us on track to net zero. So looking at the net zero treasury review that was happening this year, but also the spending review that we were expecting later this year. So we had commissioned some work from Vivid Economics, which looked at the investments needed, but also the co-benefits and the growth opportunities that are really on offer from a transition to net zero. And we were ready to publish it just before we went into lockdown. And we got Vivid to repurpose it into a green recovery piece, because a lot of what was in there was still very relevant to the situation we're in today. And I think, Bim, you touched on it at the beginning about whether climate change will still be as important after this. And I think what this report really highlights is that climate change really needs to be at the heart of this, because green recovery offers a lot more than investing in brown industries. On a top line, for every pound invested in low carbon investment, it returns 3 to 8 times the initial investment. So that we published this report last week. I'll go into a lot more detail, I think, throughout the session in some of the questions today. And similar findings, I think, to what Sam touched on at the beginning. We flagged areas that had high job creation, could be scaled up quickly, and could offer economic benefits. So energy efficiency obviously is a key one that has the highest number of job creation. Power is another really critical one. Transport, nature, in terms of these are often very rural jobs. And also I think we've really seen the importance of nature over the last 3 months and what it can offer in terms of improved health and quality of life. And also CCS, which Sam also touched on, which has high job creation. And WWF over the last 3 months have not only been looking at this evidence base to really make the case that green is the best way forward, but also looking at how we can look at integrating net zero a lot more into Treasury's thinking around green recovery. And we've been looking at and exploring with stakeholders a net zero test, which would encourage Treasury to make sure that they were aligning with their net zero commitments, and making sure that the spending we're doing is resilient and fit for future generations. The Vivid report also highlights that there's 90 billion of benefits up for offer, and that's looking at kind of improved health from air quality, the growth opportunities, and the cost of inaction. I've also been working closely with the Climate Coalition on a wider NGO piece, and on Monday we sent in a letter to the PM with over 57 charities, which looks at some of the things that we think are really crucial to a green recovery. And this is alongside, I think it's been amazing the amount of support we've seen with over 200 businesses writing in on green recovery and the importance of it, as well as from the health voices and also within government. So yeah, keen to get into the details of our report. I'm really interested in the discussion today. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much for that. Very, very interesting. And I was particularly interested in your focus on the sort of economic aspects of this, because I think what is heartening and interesting about the debate is the extent to which people who come at it from different places, so you're the WWF, you're not the World Economic Foundation, you know, you're obviously thinking about nature, but yet you're recognizing the integral part that nature and the economy have together, and making sure that we don't see these things as different silos. They actually are all connected, and I think that's a very good point. I'm going to unusually limit myself to not now getting into lots of questions. I first want to hear from our vice chairs, Caroline Lucas and Alan Brown, and any questions they might have. And then we'll get into some broader questions, and I'll come in a bit later. So Caroline Lucas, leader of the Green Party and MP for Brighton Pavilion, I think.
Definitely MP for Brighton Pavilion, leader of the Westminster Green Party. One might say, but not of the. I
thought I got that wrong. Sorry.
Listen, that was a really fascinating set of presentations. Thank you so much. And I was really heartened by how much commonality, I guess, there was between the different presentations, albeit coming from different angles. And for me, this issue around sort of place-based jobs and that job creation potential is so important on this, because I think we can make such a strong case to Treasury that it's not the case that the recovery should be green because we're making special pleading for the environment. The case, although we are, but the case is that the recovery should be green because that is the economically best thing to do in terms of the return on investment and the great report that WWF and others have done. But I wanted to ask in particular, when it comes to the issue around jobs, what do we do and what do you think the role of industry is in terms of supporting those who are currently in high carbon jobs and who stand to lose their jobs as we shift to a zero carbon economy? And it seems to me that that is where the biggest resistance will be, quite understandably. If someone's current job is what they need to put food on the table, then if we're saying that in oil and gas, for example, and in many other high carbon industries, aviation and others, there'll be fewer jobs. What responsibility do you think the industry has for the retraining, for the financing, for the support, and what responsibility does government have? Because it just feels to me that is where some of the biggest resistance is going to come from. You know, we're already seeing it when it comes to the bailouts for some of the aviation industry. No qualifications were linked to those bailouts, no criteria, they were just bailouts. So public money is actually going to support some of the most environmentally damaging industries. I'm not saying we shouldn't be supporting those workers, I think we should, but I'd love to hear your views about how we do that in a way that also means that we're supporting the green recovery and a shift to those low carbon or zero carbon jobs as well.
Someone jump in.
I'm happy to, if you can hear me. I was particularly taken by a report came out from the Energy and Utility Skills a week or so ago that is in partnership with industry. And I think the statistic, and as you were talking, I just brought up the statistics, I thought it was quite staggering, was that 27% of the workforce in the energy sector at the moment will retire in the next 10 years. And then actually, we then combine that retirement with the growth of jobs, we're going to need to replace or retrain 48% of the workforce, which equates to 277,000 people in the next 10 years. I mean, that is a staggering number. And I think industry have come forward with that report, with the energy and utility skills. And I think we have a key role to play. I think it's vitally important. I think what we have learned over the course of the kind of transition that's taken place already is there are some transferable skills. We've taken oil and gas people and moved them into offshore wind, for instance. And you look at gas engineers, I think there's something like 100,000 gas engineers. Well, actually, if we're going to have to replace 30 million domestic heat systems into low carbon, that's 1.5 million heat systems every year. So we are going to have to reskill and retrain those gas engineers, because it's going to be a huge program. So I totally agree with you, Caroline. I think there's a key role to play for government and industry. And I think actually setting out some of the ambitions, setting out some of the targets. And I think that's actually why we say in our report, if we can commit to 1 million homes by 2025, actually it provides that training and the route and the jobs that we can kind of have some semblance of a sense of direction. And even if someone sort of said to me, well, what if that 1 million is in the wrong heating system, that we put people onto electric or something different? So we still have 26 million homes to do. So let's learn in the next 5 years about kind of what we can achieve.
Anybody else want to come in on that?
Yeah, I'll come in briefly, Bim, if that's okay. Just so, as Caroline said, some of these companies are extraordinarily difficult kind of, crisis, existential kind of crisis moment. And the smart ones are really thinking very hard about how they're going to jump to new markets, and they're going to build on their skills. And quite rightly, those should be because what you've got in many of these sectors is a kind of speeding up of a thing that they thought was probably going to happen over 10 years, and it's probably being crunched down into a few months. And obviously the aviation, the oil and gas sector, parts of the auto sector are really threatened. So I do think they have a responsibility, not just a moral responsibility. They probably have a responsibility to their kind of thinking about their commercial future. One thing that I think is really important as well, and Sam makes the point about how many the kind of missing skills gap in the building sector, which I think is important. To decarbonize your house is an extremely difficult thing to do, and you've really got to be committed to it, and you've got to become your own project manager and your kind of thermal engineer and all of this kind of stuff, which is obviously a million miles away from what we need, where you want to be able to do it as easy as to convert your roof. You want to be able to phone one person or get a couple of quotes, and then for them to sort it out, and to get support to do that. We are miles away from that. You have to be the person that coordinates that at this stage. But my one word of caution on that is, it's really important that we don't just train a load of people and give them a kind of promise that there's going to be these great markets, unless the markets are actually being unlocked as well, right? The incentive to actually move to low carbon buildings at the moment is extremely weak, and is kind of negative in that sense. Even where there is a strong example in kind of energy efficiency, people don't take it up, because it's not seen as that consumer offer. There was a bit, when there's been previous efforts, there's been a big training exercise and lots of people are being converted, and then there's no work for people to do, right? And that is really dangerous disillusionment. So companies have responsibility, but also government has to think about what the policies are that are going to be going forward.
Okay, very good. Alan Brown, do you want to come in? You're muted. There we are.
Hi, thanks, Bim. Apologies, I was a bit late. I was caught up in B's committee meeting. Guy, earlier on, I heard you saying there's a new report out about opportunities for nuclear. Now, I'm well aware I shouldn't ask a question you might not get the answer that you want, but it seems to me, so Hinkley's a 35-year concession, £92.50 strike rate, versus offshore wind just under £40 for a 15-year concession. So why, and obviously it takes so long to get nuclear projects up and running, so why, when we're trying to get to net zero, do we want to commit so much money to nuclear projects when technology is evolving, prices are changing, and we're trying to get what's called a green industrial revolution? So, what would be the real advantage in tying the UK bill payers up in further long-term nuclear concessions?
I'll come straight back to that. Thanks, Alan. So the report, the first thing I say is you've got to be thinking about how the whole energy system is going to decarbonize. you know, therefore you have to maintain the system properties that we want at this stage. Now, there is a lot of promise about flexibility, and our electric vehicles are going to provide, you know, batteries to the system that we're not going to do that. And I see that as a really exciting opportunity. But with our kind of current information about how you need to balance the system, and it's worth saying a doubling of electricity demand, right? You know, up to 650 terawatt hours, or potentially more, depending on how you produce the low carbon hydrogen you want. Ruling out nuclear as an option is, I think, a bit, you know, our analysis would say a bit premature. That said, all your challenges, and we make this very clear in our report, the nuclear industry, and indeed government with it, has basically a kind of almost an existential moment over the next 10 years. If it can't take cost reduction as seriously as the renewable sector has done, then it will just fade away. And that's not just a kind of, you know, the systems kind of benefits are significant, but from a political point of view, and all the points you've raised. So we're very clear that, you know, any new nuclear program needs to be accompanied by a serious cost reduction program, which is again an industry and a government challenge.
Okay, thanks. Does Sam or Isabella want to add anything to that?
Yeah, very happy to come in on that, Alan. Sorry, apologies. I'm currently working in a shed in the garden. There's now a storm outside, so if I start taking cover under the desk, you'll know why. Yeah, I think as Guy said, we kind of know that we're going to be moving to kind of, you know, much greater use of electrification, kind of electrified heating, electrified transport, as well as kind of, you know, economic growth. So to kind of rule out technologies at this stage is probably not the most sensible thing to do. And I think on the financing package, I know there's government's doing a lot of work looking at alternatives and whether or not that's a RAB model or something else to try and get those costs you know, more competitive and to get the cost down. I think it's sensible. I think I'm kind of with Guy in the fact that, you know, we're going to need a suite of technologies, and I think, you know, we're going to be having nuclear as part of the kind of the mix as we move towards net zero.
Okay, can I just quickly ask Sam? I mean, why would they look at the RAB model for nuclear? Should that not be considerations for, say, pumped hydro, for tidal, like for other?
Yeah, I think, as I kind of said in my opening remarks. Yeah, as I sort of said in my opening remarks, I think there's kind of, you know, we don't want to take any technologies off the table at the moment, and I think you might be looking at a RAB model for sort of parts of the CCUS model as well. So I think there are going to be different financing mechanisms for different parts of the system. The CFD has done brilliantly for offshore wind, and we're obviously bringing in more renewables into that system as well, and has done, you know, has achieved what it set out to do. And that might not be the right model for all parts of the system, but I think there are going to have to be ways that we can bring forward investment across all technologies. To be honest with you, Alan, at this point in time, given that the challenges that we know that we face moving to net zero.
Okay, Isabella, please.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I think our position would be slightly different. And we have done modelling, particularly looking at earlier EV phase out date of 2030. And we think you don't need new additional nuclear power. And we would kind of be keen to, I suppose, put the investment into the renewable technologies that are deliverable and cost effective, and look at alternatives in terms of the battery storage. And for us, we've kind of got a strong position on that side. So focusing on the cleaner renewable technologies.
So just before I bring in Caroline Lucas, who I know wants to come in, could you summarize, I know it's complicated and there's modeling, but could you summarize, Isabella, what that looks like? Because I have taken the view, having thought a lot about this and looking at it in detail, that nuclear does provide a sort of very long-term steady, I know we're not meant to use this term baseload anymore, but, you know, baseload of energy, that renewable energy, obviously, as we all know, needs to grow. But seeing as we, and I think it was Guy who started off by saying, you know, there's going to be a doubling of power demand in the next 30 years, it would strike me as being quite risky to not include nuclear as part of that mix. Could you just explain how you think you could deal with a doubling of the energy demand without having nuclear?
Yes, I'm feeling a bit rusty on this one. I haven't looked at our position for a while, but when we did it with the modelling with Vivid Economics, we kept in the additional, the existing nuclear plants. And I think at the time we were keen to look at extensions and whether they were available and possible. I think for us, when we looked at it, we had a system that had very high solar, wind, it had backup battery storage, and it had small CCGT, which ran for very limited amount of time. But for us, I mean, the nuclear point is quite a big one for us. The cost doesn't often reflect the decommissioning, the waste associated with it. I think for us is kind of a hard line. So I think there are some questions that need to be answered, but the modelling that we did with Vivid Economics did show it was possible by 2030, and I'm happy to follow up with the detailed briefing.
You send it round, because I'd be really interested in that. Caroline Lucas.
Yeah, sorry. I mean, I want to focus more on what we agree on rather than what we disagree. But I couldn't let Guy and Sam get away with this. You know, Guy, that must just be the biggest example of hope over experience. The idea that the nuclear industry is going to come in with some reduced costs. There is no example that I'm aware of anywhere in the world where nuclear has even come in on the cost it originally planned, let alone coming in under cost. At the head of the national grid themselves has said that we don't need nuclear for so-called baseload, that all of these other things that we're talking about in terms of increased battery technologies and so forth can do the job for us. Nuclear is also just so slow, and we don't even need to look at, you know, how Hinkley is massively over time, but right across Finland, France, again, no example of nuclear coming in on time. It's really slow. And although it sounds so reasonable to say, don't rule out any technology, you know, that sounds such a sensible thing to say. Actually, it's not terribly sensible, because it doesn't give any clear steer to investors in other technologies. If they think you're just going to be constantly hedging your bets between different technologies, then you don't send out a clear message to investors. If we were to say no new nuclear, then that would be a really clear signal to get the investment where we need it, which is into the green energy alternatives instead. And the last thing, just to add to what Isabella said, was obviously the scenarios that we're talking about would need a massive investment in energy efficiency, but we need that anyway. So let's just get on and do it.
Okay, there we are. I always thought I was quite reasonable, Caroline, but anyway, maybe I'm not. I'm just going to bring in some of the questions we've had come through on the Q&A. Alan Cairns, former Secretary of State for Wales, has asked a question that, and I'm just going to summarize it. As we develop initiatives to speed up economic recovery and meet net zero targets, where there's sort of markets that are already mature and where standards need to be agreed. You know, we're talking about where we have common standards, and they're in places, you know, they're in things like universal charging mechanism for cars, home heating integrating with smart grids, etc. Is there a sort of sense where we know we've got common standards and where we need to sort of agree some common standards so as to help and speed up the economic recovery and the net zero target? Does anybody want to take that on?
I'll come in briefly on that, Bim, if that's all right. It's a really important question, and it's absolutely essential for the transformation we're talking about. Its interoperability is absolutely essential. As anyone's got a kind of electric vehicle and has 3 cables in the back of their boot that you've constantly got to, you know, which is a kind of extraordinary difference from what you expect. And if you think about the world we're moving to, where you've also got to have your electric vehicle to be able to coordinate with your heating system, and potentially other items in your home to provide that flexibility, which we all see is really important. That is a massive challenge. You know, if you compare it to telecoms industry and the kind of pain to get to GSM standards and those kind of things, that's the kind of scale that you're talking about. So there's bits of that happening, but it really does need to be sped up and coordinated. All the different elements of interoperability, not just devices can talk to each other, but also that you're not stuck with you know, if you take out a kind of heat pump on a long-term lease, that you're not stuck with one supplier for 15 years. You're still able to switch, but that people are able to get their capital back from the infrastructure investment. So it's the digital technology that is coming and is going to be in people's homes needs a whole new set of standards. So I think if that's what Alan was referring to, I think there's bits being done, but we're still nowhere near what we need to do.
Alan, do you want to come in?
If that's okay, Bim, what I was hoping that if I could just ask each of the panellists in terms of green job creation and net zero opportunities, what would be their number one ask in the energy white paper that's supposed to be coming out? So I suppose we'll go Sam first, then Isabella, then Guy.
Yeah, very happy to. I think the number one thing that we could probably move on quite quickly is looking at energy efficiency. Oh, sorry, it's just, sorry, I don't know if you start copying that. I think the number one thing you'd start off with would be energy efficiency, Alan. I think if we can kind of, start to retrofit programs, unleash some of the kind of the funding that government's put aside, but also kind of people that don't need the government funding, the able to pay sector, that actually let's start putting standards on, let's start kind of, maybe we can look at reducing VAT, for instance, on energy efficient products to get people to kind of, stimulate and buy those. So I would say certainly we're looking at energy efficiency. I think there are then things around kind of unlocking some of the generation capacity and building works, but that is kind of probably a little bit more longer term as opposed to sort of shovel ready, if you like, in terms of sort of getting energy efficiency off the ground and stimulating that market.
Okay, thanks.
Just to add to that, I would say energy efficiency is obviously a really, really critical one. In our Vivid report that we published last week, it actually has the highest job creation, 85,000 direct jobs in green retrofitting and at least 7,000 in heating and cooling, which obviously will grow as that sector increases. And I think also important that those jobs are often quite widespread across the country. They're also, I think the Aldersgate report says that 3 out of 4 of those are in SMEs, which obviously need the support at the moment. And I think the ONS data shows that 59% of businesses in constructions are laying people off in the short term, which is the highest out of any sector. So I think energy efficiency is a really important one for us that we flag in the Vivid report. I think the power sector is another one, particularly upgrading our grid infrastructure. I think we've seen some amazing things happen in the last 3 months. We've had 2 months without coal. We've seen a drop in demand. We've seen particularly high renewable energy generation. And we've seen very low oil and gas prices. And I think we're starting to see what the future system might look like. And I think we need to use this time and this recovery to make sure we're really investing in our infrastructure so that the grid is fit for the transition that we are already on. And I think a transition that we really know needs to happen, because we can't go from one crisis into another climate and environment crisis. So we need to really prepare ourselves and make sure we're resilient. And then I suppose transport and electric vehicles is another one that we flag, and that in particular in terms of growth opportunities of import and export. But our Vivid report also says there could be at least 11,000 jobs and 5,500 in batteries and charging infrastructure. So I think those are 3 really critical ones that we know we can do now and that can scale up and are really important for that net zero transition.
Thanks.
So my slight kind of tilt on that, Alan, is I'd focus on buildings rather than just energy efficiency. I think it's really important we get away from energy efficiency is one thing and heat is another thing. The machine that we need to solve is the buildings, the people, buildings people live in, buildings people work in, and you need to understand, do you need to sort out the windows before you can get a heat pump in? What's the right size of radiator? All of these things need to be seen together. But I would agree that from a kind of for the jobs reasons, for the local reasons, and the other reasons that buildings is number one. I would say delivered at a kind of devolved regional local level, because the requirements are going to be very different. If you've got a town with a lot of modern buildings, the heating requirement is going to be quite low. But if you're in an area which has got 100-year-old homes, it's a much more difficult project. You need to understand the specifics of a particular area, the data, the state of the housing stock, state of the grid, all of those things. It's very hard to do it, as Bim said, from Whitehall. A model can tell you that there's 4 million homes that accept. You need to know where these homes are, and that means you need to act at a kind of local level.
That's a really interesting point, and it brings me to a question that Hannah Wilson asked on the Q&A, and it's one that I was going to ask as well, which is, we keep coming out with these stats. There's something that I saw from the IEA today that says there'll be sort of almost 2 million jobs created over, I don't know what period of time, but in relation to building efficiency. Came out today. You've got, everybody's mentioned 4 million homes, 1 million homes. The question is from Hannah, how are we practically actually going to do this? So who are these people? So the people who will be doing this work, what are they doing now? And how are we going to get them all to do it? And secondly, who's going to buy all this stuff? Because the upfront capital cost of buying sort of heating systems is still reasonably high, though of course we all want that cost to come down. It's not something you're just going to do with no thought. It's something that a lot of people just will not be able to afford. So even in, my constituency is a fairly wealthy one, and in my constituency, I think a majority of people would not say they don't have the money to do this. So, it will be a lot different in poorer constituencies. Again, you've got rental homes. What do you do about them in relation to people's willingness to spend money on, landlords' willingness to spend money on it, and the tenants' willingness to spend money on those things is going to be lower. So I'm just interested in people's view of practically how on earth this gets done. Can anyone tell me? No?
I'll give it a go, Bim.
Yeah.
So as I see it, it's buildings is not, there's not one policy or one on instrument that's going to do it, right? You need a kind of suite of areas that are going to be doing it. So what would be the elements? So I've banged on about it in this, and I'll keep banging on about it until people will take it up and see it seriously, which is the need for local area energy planning. So properly, understanding which areas need that.
Sorry to interrupt, because you said that before and I was going to ask you. Okay, but what are the units you're using? Because they're going to be different, say, if you're talking about parts of London than they are parts of Norfolk, which is going to be different in. No, but what building blocks are you using for that local planning? Who should be doing that planning?
So we piloted it in 3 areas over the last couple of years, in Newcastle, in Bury, and in Bridgend, but others have done similar things. There's 3 elements to it. One, you need a kind of the data about the system. So some of that is network data, some of that is housing data, some of that is data that local authorities have, etc. Then you need a process run by, led by a local authority, really, in partnership with the networks and others, to work through the different scenarios that are actually credible based on real data. Because frankly, lots of what you get when a local area does a kind of bit of planning is a couple of high-profile white elephant projects, not a real serious plan to get there. And then you also need to work with the local communities to actually build consent for what you're doing. Because the transformation the changes you're asking people to do, if they're just dropped on it from a local authority level versus a national level, it doesn't really make much difference to them.
So do you think that should be county councils then, and mayoral authorities?
Well, it's one of the questions, because local authorities are organised in an almost perfectly imperfect way to versus the energy system. The right unit of an energy system is about 300,000 population.
300,000. Okay, that's interesting.
That's what you do if you just think about it from energy. But I'm very well aware that getting a town to talk to the county and the local authorities would. But it's what needs to happen.
Okay.
happy to come in on this, Bim. Really happy to come in on this, Bim. I think it's a really, really important question, and I think there is kind of no single answer. I actually have seen some of the stuff that the Energy Systems Catapult are talking around on local area energy planning, and I'm kind of fully with Guy that this is kind of, you know, one of the key routes that we need to look at. If you're looking at energy efficiency, I think you're looking at sort of how we can set standards. And that's kind of in building regulations, in kind of, you know, retrofitting people's, you know, as people kind of do DIY. It's also setting standards on new build properties and product standards. I think we can look at how we can reduce costs. So that's kind of, you know, whether or not, you know, there are financial mechanisms out there around kind of, you know, green mortgages and looking to kind of, you know, how we can do that. I've mentioned around lowering VAT, perhaps to try and make these kind of, you know, energy efficient products more amenable. Or actually, one other alternative is how government can use the kind of the package to kind of drive demand. And, you know, one of the areas that we've kind of looked at is, well, you know, how can we set a minimum standard, maybe in kind of, you give people a long lead time and say, actually, if you're going to sell a property or rent a property, it has to meet a certain energy efficiency standard, and give people that time and, you know, the financing to actually then go around and do that.
So I understand that, and that what you're saying makes sense. But so say you did all of that today, right? All the things you're asking for, we did it today. Where are the people going to come from? Where are the skills going to come from? I mean, how do we actually have the people and the companies to actually do this? Is there the existing capacity to do this? Or are we hoping that by changing incentives on the fiscal side and by changing regulations, it will create businesses and people to go into the industry? Is that basically what we're hoping? Or do we think that we would need something more targeted to train up a group of people in order to do this?
You need something targeted. You know, you need to have the markets, but again, it's why the local area might, you know, is the right unit to be pushing this. The kind of people who, you know, you're looking at, you know, in the kind of technical skills language, you're looking about, you know, kind of level 3, level 4 kind of stuff. So it's the equivalent of people who are installing boilers at the moment. It's that kind of level. You know, it's skilled work. Because you've got to think, you know, you've got to think about the buildings, etc. And you need like 100,000 of these people across the country. And right now we have, you know, probably, I would, you know, less than 1,000, I would have thought, who've got that
Yeah.
So, but it's not a million miles away from kind of, you know, what people converting lofts are doing, or builders are doing, or those kind of areas. You know, it's that kind of area. But you do need the incentives so that people actually think it's worthwhile to do it, because people are busy, right?
And I think as well, the Energy Efficiency Industry Group published a quite detailed report, I think it was last week, which really highlights this point on how do we actually deliver it and what is really needed. And I think in the framing of the green recovery, there's a point as well around furloughed employees or other workers that are unable to return to construction sites that offer training for low carbon skills in the short term. So it's kind of looking at what we can do in the short term, and then in the longer term, there's that skills and productivity gap for net zero construction. And in order to meet the EPC target, we need to support a lot more jobs, and we need to have, I suppose, as Caroline flagged in her question earlier, it's a kind of partnership between the industry and government, that you set that direction, but you also have the transition and the skills in place, whether that's regional just transition commissions or reforming the skills system. Some of those options, kind of looking at the different angles on that. But I would recommend the Energy Efficiency Industry Group's report last week, because that goes into a lot of detail of what's really needed.
Very good. And we've got, I know we're running out of time, so I'm going to ask one question and then we'll go to the final question, which is, if you had 30 seconds with the Chancellor ahead of his statement in July, what would you ask for? So think about that for a second. But just one more question from Jeremy Hodge, who made a point about networks and electricity transmission. So his point was, how can Ofgem ensure the extra ambitious investment plans on the electricity transmission and distribution networks that we are going to need in order to manage all this new electricity we're going to be generating without nuclear? who wants to take that on in terms of the network infrastructure? And off Jen.
Yeah, happy to come in, Bim.
Go for it, Sam, because otherwise I was going to have to answer.
No, that's all right. Well, you can answer after me. I think it's a really key question, actually, and I think it's the Committee on Climate Change also focused on this with Chris Stark. Was I shared a panel with him a few weeks ago, and I think there is a kind of relatively low regrets if we are investing in our network already and we know what we're going to need, and to actually kind of overinvest now, to kind of move towards the decarbonised future. So I think there certainly is a role for that. I think there's also kind of got to be a balance in the fact that we can do things with more to digitalise our energy networks and to kind of get more data in there about how we can actually build in some flexibility as well. So I think we almost need to do both, to be honest with you. We need to kind of see how we can use our existing assets more flexibly, but also open up the opportunity that's kind of the low regrets if we know that we're going to be doubling our electricity demand. So I think there's almost a role for both, that we need to kind of look at anticipatory investment, but also how we can use things more flexibly.
Okay, thank you. For the final question, if we'd start with Isabella, just if you had 30 seconds with the Chancellor, and by the way, you only have 30 seconds with the Chancellor, so you can't now give an answer which is longer than 30 seconds. What would you ask for, Isabella?
Yeah, so I briefly touched on it at the beginning, but WWF are calling for a net zero test to be implemented within Treasury. And that is to make sure that spending decisions are aligned with their greenhouse gas commitments. And that, for example, would not rule out bailing out certain sectors, but it would make sure that those sectors then had a pathway to achieve net zero. And this is really important for us because we know we need to become more resilient as we come out of this, and we need to make ourselves more resilient to the climate and environment emergency coming.
Thank you. Guy, why don't you go next?
So I pitch for 5 cities, towns, or places to be pathfinders for net zero, as a kind of exemplar to the rest of the country. Run a competition so that the places compete to try and get to net zero as quickly as possible, and provide the funding, the planning, the regulatory freedom that they need to get there, focusing on their buildings and their transport system.
And Brighton in for that one.
Yeah, there we are. Said with a wink. Sam.
Yeah, I think I agree with what Guy and Isabella have just said, so hopefully they're with me as well and can spend their 30 seconds talking about that. I think I'd also kind of just say that, invest in what we know that we're going to need as we move towards net zero. So we know we're going to need to invest in networks, EVs, heat, energy efficiency, low carbon generation, etc. So actually, let's see where we can bring that investment forward at a kind of a low regrets.
Okay, and Caroline and Alan, do you want to have any last, if there's anything you would be asking for that you think we need to do that hasn't been said or maybe hasn't been focused on so far?
Sorry, am I muted or not muted?
No, you're not muted.
No, I guess all I would add, I love those 2 ideas already out there. I just do think that a proper home insulation scheme, I think we could really accelerate that. I think for social housing, it would need to be free. I think the incentives in the paid for sector would need to be massive. We've seen how it all went wrong with the Green Deal last time around, so that's kind of how not to do it. So, but nonetheless, in terms of getting jobs in every single constituency, in terms of getting our emissions down, that's what I would do.
Perfect. Alan, any thoughts from your end?
Thinking back to where there seemed to be consensus about investing in energy efficiency, so we really need to get a massive commitment to that, along with the heat decarbonisation.
Yeah, and for what it's worth, as we come to the end, I think that the energy efficiency is key, but I think accompanying that does need to be very, very practical roadmap for how you get people to do the jobs we need and get the finances in, because there's no point setting a rule and there not being the people to do it and people not having the money to do it. So I think that it's all very well setting those, but if we are going to do that, we have to do something very interventionist and quite big. in order to support that. That's it. It's 1 o'clock. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Thank you. I think it's been a really interesting discussion. I've learned a huge amount. So I hope you have too. So I just want to say thank you to our star guest, Sam Hollister from EnergyUK, Guy Newey from the Energy Systems Catapult, and Isabella O'Dowd from WWF. And Isabella, Guy and Sam, if you've got anything that you think people might want to see or read that's come out of this, please do send it to the group, and then I'll make sure they get distributed to everybody. And of course, thank you to Caroline and Alan as well.